It's 2:06 at 89.3 KPCC.
I'm Pat Morrison. Domestic violence is responsible for an immense amount of death and suffering in this country. Once in a while, women fight back, and the question of whether or not the system treats them fairly when they do is one of the subjects dealt with in the documentary Sin by Silence, a documentary about a female inmate support group for victims of domestic abuse and how they're coping with their sentences and with the laws that put them there. Joining me in studio to talk about this is Olivia Klaus, who is director and producer of Sin by Silence. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's going to be screening throughout Southern California throughout the summer and going on a national tour. You are going on national tour with the film. Also joining me is Alyce LaViolette, the domestic violence counselor for survivors and perpetrators, and an expert witness in the case of the woman we'll be hearing from in a moment. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pat.
And that woman is Brenda Clubine, who I met a number of years ago at a hearing in the prison where she had been sentenced after killing her partner. She is founder of the support group featured in the documentary. You have been out for 8 months after serving 26 years behind bars. How are you doing?
Wonderful.
I'm glad to hear it. So, Olivia Klaus, domestic violence seems to be something that is always with us. How did you decide that it is worthy of a documentary?
You're right, Pat. Domestic violence has always been around. It is a crisis that is not going to go away anytime soon. And I have never experienced an abusive relationship, but that doesn't mean it hasn't affected me. I got a phone call about 8 years ago from a friend of mine who was asking for help. And I had no idea where to turn. It completely shattered me. And I started on this journey to find answers of why is she still with him? Or why does she leave and keep going back? And what are the options? What about the kids? And really, the only answers I found were in prison with this group. A colleague of mine introduced me to this group, Convicted Women Against Abuse, and they really hold the keys to the answers I was looking for, because they survived the ultimate violence.
And Brenda Clubine, you talk in the documentary about organizing the group, about finding it for a lot of women, it was the only way they could express themselves and feel they had any kind of power over what was happening to them, and to find out that you had so much in common was an empowering experience too.
Absolutely. What had happened was these women needed an opportunity to heal and have a place where they could discuss their feelings and everything they'd gone through and understand that all of that madness didn't belong to them. They didn't have to be accountable for that behavior. And it's been just amazing. They've grown, they've just come out of their shells, and they're healing. They're healing, and they're understanding that they can make decisions for themselves. They can feel good about themselves, and they have a future to look forward to.
We'll get to your personal story in a minute, but first I'd like to ask Alyce LaViolette, who was a witness in your trial. The law changed, Miss LaViolette, because for 150 years in California, self-defense was essentially about two guys in a bar brawl, each of them pulling a weapon on another. Whereas when women kill their abusers, it involves a different set of circumstances usually. How did the law change to accommodate that?
Well, the law didn't change to accommodate that. And initially, in fact, it wasn't until the mid-1990s that we had any kind of acceptability for domestic or battered women syndrome to be heard. When Brenda's case was heard, pretty much battered women syndrome was looked at as more prejudicial than informative, and the standard for self-defense was kind of euphemistically called the reasonable man's defense. What would a reasonable man do in this situation? So there was not any, and crimes of passion, in fact, were used to mediate when men killed women in intimate relationships, but there was no mediating defense for women.
It was used as an excuse.
Absolutely. Came out of Old English common law.
Now, here's a moment from the documentary where one of the members of Convicted Women Against Abuse speaks out about her experience. Her name is Virgil, and she's talking about how the standards are different, as you were saying.
Somebody said, if he didn't hit his friends, and he didn't hit his boss who made him angry, he made conscious decisions while he was angry that you weren't worth holding back from.
And Alyce LaViolette, has that been a double standard, do you think, when you go to court and you testify in some of these cases?
It was a double standard. it's much different now. You don't see crimes of passion used as a mediating defense, and battered women syndrome is really used under the sort of the rubric of post-traumatic stress disorder. But people are willing to listen to it now, and that really has come from education and media shows like this that help people to understand why women stay.
Here's another moment from the documentary called Sin by Silence. Here, Glenda, who is also a member of Convicted Women Against Abuse, she's still in prison, and she's explaining how this battered woman syndrome was not admissible in court.
There were no laws at that time to make domestic violence, battered woman syndrome, admissible. The judge allowed it, but they made a sham of it. They told the jury, this is not a legal defense. We're only allowing her to tell what took place.
Brenda Clubine, tell us your story about how you killed your husband and how some of the limitations on what you could bring in at the time and what you couldn't. What part of your story you couldn't tell?
Well, essentially, unfortunately, in one night, my life changed for 26 years. And I needed to protect myself. And the district attorney would not allow me to testify about specific incidents of abuse between my husband and I. And initially, the judge had agreed to allow me an expert witness. And then just prior to the defense putting on their case, it was denied because there had been no precedent set. And because of the jury only heard bits and very small pieces, they weren't able to understand, again, why a woman stays, how this affects her, how walking on eggshells all the time makes things different, and that whole reasonable man syndrome doesn't fit into a battered woman situation.
And then you were in prison when you wrote to Governor Wilson and said, hey, this is a different deal from what the law allows at this point. What was his response, and how did you get members of the state legislature to come hear your stories?
Well, basically, what had happened was I had sent a booklet out to every governor and every legislator and every senator, not just in the state of California, but in all the states. And I got a letter from, at that time, Jackie Spear, who was the head of the California Women's Legislative Caucus.
Now a member of Congress.
Yes. And she and John Burton, etc., a whole bunch of them came down to CIW. We held a public hearing on domestic violence.
That's the California Institute for Women.
Yes. And there were 12 people, 12 women from CWAA testified, and they testified about the type of abuse they suffered from, the nightmare, the silence, what it cost. And ultimately, from that public hearing, on January the 2nd of the following year of 1992, 1107 of the Evidence Code came into effect that then afforded the battered woman syndrome to be admissible and used as evidence in a court of law.
And has that now been taken up by other states as well?
There are a few, actually, that it has been taken up, and it's spreading. It's spreading. Hopefully like fire soon.
Well, Brenda Clubine, how has it changed what has happened in court? Have women been acquitted because of this? Have their sentences been altered because of this?
The type of charge, normally you're charged immediately with first-degree murder. Women are being charged with manslaughter, and they're being acquitted. If they're going on trial, many women are being acquitted. So there's a lot. They're looking at things a lot different now, and they're paying attention to the subtlety of what happened and how things happened and what all the circumstances were, and they are no longer just picking and choosing what they allow.